These are the most evil torture methods in human history, and I can guarantee that you haven't heard of some of these. The first torture method is one found on nearly every continent, except for maybe that one. It was called immurement, which literally means walling in. Victims would typically be sealed into a wall or cage of some sort. They'd be chained to the wall and forced to watch as they got slowly sealed off from the outside world, brick by brick. Depending on the goal of the immurement, the hole would vary in size. Sometimes it was coffin-shaped and victims would be trapped horizontally. Other times, it wouldn't even be tall enough to stand up in, and victims would be forced to crouch awkwardly until their muscles gave out completely. Death would not come swiftly, often taking multiple days or even weeks to pass away. There are plenty of cases of people surviving weeks imprisoned, only to be pulled out for a swift time and then crammed right back in. But that's not all. Sometimes the victims would be fed food and water while imprisoned, just to prolong the experience. You wouldn't want them dying of thirst now, would you? And it gets worse. One form of immurement had the victims sealed into the ground only up to their necks. And let me tell you, it was not for their own comfort. Being trapped like that would serve to expose them to the elements. The sun would bake their skin raw, and any nearby animal would feel safe to take chunks out of them. It would not be the greatest of experiences. I think for me, the worst part would be the bugs crawling all over you and ripping you to shreds. Slowly, of course. But next up is one that I think is even more horrifying. It's called the strappado. Just reading about this technique made my bones shiver, and I hope it does the same for you. So, victims of this torture technique would have their arms tied behind their back with some sort of handcuffs. Then a rope would be tied from their hands to a beam. Generally, the beam would be at the top of a ledge. It needed height in order for the rest of the process to work. At this point, the victim would be chucked off the ledge, destined to drop until their arms stopped the fall. Of course, when your hands are tied behind your back, it's really not your arms stopping the fall as much as it is your shoulders. This initial drop would absolutely shred the connectors in your shoulders. A lot of the time, it would break them instantly. Then they'd just leave you to hang for a bit. You'd sit there just dangling and writhing due to the pain in your broken shoulders. This was an absolute nightmare. But another variation of this method was actually my favorite. So in this variation, they would tie the rope to your wrists like normal. But instead of dropping you from a large height, they would slowly raise you up, like a quiche inside an oven. As they raised you like a quiche inside an oven, your arms would be raised higher and higher as the pressure increased, until eventually they'd be supporting your entire weight. Sometimes this would dislocate your arms, for sure, but other times it was so much worse. Your arms definitely do not love it when your entire weight is supported by them. The funny thing is, from the outside, it doesn't look like anything's wrong. But on the inside, your arms are literally dying. Wikipedia says that after a short amount of time, it can cause long-term nerve, ligament, or tendon damage. It can even lead to infarction of the muscles and rhabdomyolysis. Essentially, all that means is that if this torture were to be performed on you, you wouldn't be winning any arm wrestling tournaments in the near future. Next, the upright jerker. This is one of my personal favorites because it's simultaneously wildly horrifying and hilariously creative. So, in normal hangings, the victim has a rope tied around their neck, and then they're dropped from a platform. This will usually break their neck, or at the very least, start to strangle them efficiently, right away. This is a cruel yet very popular method of execution from history. By contrast, the upright jerker shares one thing in common with hanging: the rope around the neck. Other than that, it's essentially hanging's evil twin. Also, while you're watching, keep in mind that this machine was invented as a more humane version of hanging. Basically, instead of dropping the victim from a platform, the inventors of this beautiful machine decided that it would be better to violently fling them upwards via a gadget similar to a trebuchet. This crazy machine must have been put into use a while back then. 1600s, 1700s maybe? No. 1926. 1926 AD was the last known use of this machine. They used it to kill a gangster named Gerald Chapman. Quick side note, this guy Gerald Chapman was the first dude to be called Public Enemy number 1. That's a cool little tidbit. Anyway, the execution went about as well as you may suspect. So first the rope was tied around Chapman's neck, and he was left hanging. Not from a platform, but just dangling in the air. Then, after gurgling for a second or two, they released the counterweight, and Gerald was flung into the air and wrenched back down. Fortunately, his death came quick. After a short 9 minutes of suffering, he passed on. Again, I'd like to repeat that this was meant as a more kind and easy death than hanging was. But hey, it's okay. They only used it a few dozen more times. Gotta love the tenacity. Another torture that requires tenacity is the saw. This is a special one in my heart because you can tell that the torturers put care into this one to make it as agonizing as they possibly could. See, they could have started at the head and just left it at that. It would have been painful, but the victim would have died pretty early on. Nope, they needed to make it hurt. So they decided to flip the victim upside down and start sawing from the bottom. The victim was upside down, right? And luckily, this meant that they wouldn't bleed out very quickly. They would feel every single cut. The sawing would last minutes sometimes, and death did not come easy. Until, of course, the saw hits one of the important organs and you head straight to the underworld. That was wholesome, wouldn't you agree? Next up, we got a fun one. Chinese water torture. You may have heard of this one, it's pretty popular. The victim of this method would be placed on a bed or a board in a very restrained position. Like, I'm talking clamps around your head so you can't move it left or right. Then, some sort of contraption is placed above your head. Generally, it's some type of container with freezing cold water inside. That's important, by the way. It wouldn't be very effective to have a tub of, like, lukewarm water. The victim will be placed in a quiet room as well, like a dungeon or a hole, etc. Then, the water will start to drip, straight onto the forehead of the victim. At the start, it's nothing. It's just some cold water. But as time goes on, the water starts to get more impactful. Each drop is like a thunderclap. It's around that time that the pain starts. It feels like the water is drilling a hole straight to your brain. In reality, you're a fool, because it has little to no effect at this point. As the hours and the days creep by, all your thoughts turn to the dripping water. Each drop is like a hammer to your skull, and your brain is slowly being shredded from the inside out. A very important key detail of this torture method is to make sure that the drops are irregular. If they come consistently, then they're predictable, and it's almost like meditation. Almost. But if the drops come irregularly, the victim has to watch as they slowly build up, drop, and then repeat the process for hours. Imagine not being able to tell when the next one's coming, but knowing that it's inevitable. Reminds me of Star Wars these days. Speaking of spinning rapidly in a circle, it's time for the whirligig. Before I tell you about it, take a look at the Wikipedia page. It's like 2 sentences. So I suppose this torture wasn't very common, but I still felt the need to include it because it terrifies me deeply. Victims would be jammed inside of this little cage here, and then spun around rapidly. And then, they'd just keep going. Reminds me of those spinny things in every playground, except you can't stop it at all. Due to the lack of info about this thing, like anywhere, we aren't sure about its uses, except by the British Army and in Tangiers, where, quote unquote, it was more feared than the stocks. So yeah, no thank you, I'd rather be strapatoed. Okay, that was freaky, but not absolutely terrifying. It's kind of funny even. But for the next torture, picture the whirligig, but more evil. That's exactly what gibbeting is. And yet, at the same time, that's a terrible way to describe it. This was a torture method used commonly in England on traders, robbers, and pirates, among other interesting careers. The gibbeting itself was pretty horrifying. It was essentially a giant iron cage high in the sky that victims would be trapped inside until they die. Death would usually come in the form of freezing, or just exposure to the elements. But on occasion, people passing by would chuck stones at the people in their cages just for fun. Gibbeting came in all shapes and sizes. There was a ton of room for creativity. One of the most common ways it was used was like this. Victims would essentially be wrapped in the cage and hung there for days or weeks. One cage I read about for some reason kept only the top half and didn't even use the bottom. That must have been so painful for the dude's armpits. Another common method was used on pirates. They'd be hung just above a river at low tide, and then just left there. As the tide moved slowly upwards, they'd begin to blubber and then fully drown. They'd often be left there until the tide fully submerged them a total of 3 times. And with a lot of gibbeting cases, the bodies would just be left in the sky to rot. It really wasn't a popular practice with the common people because while it may have been fun to watch if the person was alive, it got old pretty fast as you began to inhale rotten corpse particles after a week or two. At that point, all you cared about was the smell. Next up, we got one you may not expect. Crucifixion. At face value, it seems pretty obvious what happens. But most people actually misunderstand what this process is like. So crucifixion is when someone is tied or nailed to a cross or a pole. It's been used as a form of torture and execution throughout history. Most people assume that death comes the obvious way, via the giant holes in your arms. This seems clear-cut, but really it's a lot more complicated than it seems. One guy theorized that death would come through asphyxiation, or suffocating to death. That's because your entire body is basically pulling you down, which would squeeze your arms inwards and crush your chest horizontally. People on the cross would have a hard time inhaling due to the constant tension in their chest. So they'd have to either pull themselves up by their nails or by their feet, which really didn't help the situation. But sometimes they did manage to survive on that thing for a decent while, which is where these dudes come in. The guys with the hammers. Their job, you could say, was to help you pass along. In a kind and loving way, of course. And when I say kind and loving, I mean their job was to smash your legs to pieces with giant hammers. Just the sweetest dudes. Of course, after your legs were shattered, there really wasn't much you could do except suffocate. And keep in mind that suffocation wasn't the only way you could potentially meet your end on the cross. There were plenty of other ways. Like, for example, heart failure, hypovolemic shock, acidosis, dehydration, and pulmonary embolism. So, yeah. Next up is the water cure. What a nice, friendly name, right? Look at the definition of the word cure. Relieve of the symptoms of a disease or condition. Well, clearly the person who named this thing had no access to the dictionary, because under its mildly threatening name is a very threatening procedure. Let's go through the steps. First, you wedge the victim's mouth or throat open, and ram a funnel down there. They should no longer be able to close their mouth. Side note, it helps if they can't move their arms or legs. Then you start pouring water down their throat, and here's the kicker. You don't wait for them to say when. You can stop whenever you like, if you feel like. Just be prepared for them to violently, expel that water back out. After that, however, you can do it again. Safe to say, this torture method is not a fun one to live through. Imagine being forced to drink water, but not being able to stop at all. How sick that would make you feel. If done enough times and to a large enough extent, this torture method can and will make your stomach expand in a process known as gastric distension. Basically, picture a giant balloon in your stomach expanding and pushing all your organs around. Not a wonderful feeling. It's been said of someone experiencing this torture that his sufferings must be that of a man who is drowning, but cannot drown. Huh, that one reminds me of paying taxes. I don't know why. Next up, we got a torture method focused on the other end of the body, the feet. This one was known as the Spanish boot, or just the boot. Well, what was it? Well, that question has a couple of answers. Turns out, there are like a decent amount of ways to horribly disfigure someone's feet. Who knew? The way the Scottish went about it was maybe the most interesting. They would soak animal skin in water, then wrap it around your feet and lower leg area. Then they would bind it in place with a bunch of cords. They would then put the entire thing over a fire and slowly cook it. As the rawhide cooked, it would get smaller and smaller. It didn't have enough force to fully crush the bones in your feet, but it definitely had enough to mess them up for a while. As it contracted, it would fully dislocate the bones in your feet, and you would writhe in agony as your feet snapped, crackled, and popped. Yep, the perfect time for a Rice Krispies joke. The French variation of this torture method is my personal favorite. It consisted of putting these leather boots on your feet. Not really special or anything, the only important thing is that the leather is spongy. Then they pour boiling water over the boots. Since the leather is spongy, the water soaks through the boots and into their legs. This will absolutely destroy the flesh inside the boots and the victim will be in agony. But we're not done there. The leather boots are then put inside a bigger iron boots. The iron boots are pretty loose, they themselves don't hurt that much. But for the next step, boiling water and/or oil is dumped inside of the leather boots. In this stage, the torturers can go ham with the torture methods. The boots were often soldered in place on the floor. So I like to imagine that the victim starts out standing. Then, as the oil is added, they end up flopping around like a dead fish with their boot stuck in place. That's, interesting. Now it's time for a very interesting one. This one's been pretty popular with different cultures around the world. People just really like it. That's right, it's flaying. So I know what you're thinking. You want step-by-step instructions on how to perform a flaying operation. Well, don't worry, I got you. First thing you'll need to do is to tenderize the skin in some way. One of the most common ways that people did this was by leaving the victim out in the sun all day until they burn. If that's too extreme for you, then consider boiling them alive. After that is where the fun begins. Think of it as arts and crafts, except you're only cutting. What you're going to want to do is focus on the face. That's where a ton of nerve endings are, so you'll want to target it first thing. You should use deep cuts to cut all the way to the bottom layers of skin. This will make it as painful as possible. And if you want to multiply the pain, try a dull knife to make them feel every slice. After you're done with that, make a few long cuts along the rest of the body to make the process easier on yourself. Then you can just get to ripping. Take chunks off here or there. I mean, if you really care about preserving them, you can slowly slice their skin off. But if you want to get this done quick as possible, have fun with it. Don't worry, they'll still be able to feel every single nerve ending being severed. They'll also lose a ton of blood. Don't worry, this is normal. You can actually lose more than 35% of the blood in your body before you pass. Long term, they have no chances. But short term, they could survive for hours or even days. They would feel every single speck of dust on their skin. It'd be a nightmare for however long their body decides to continue on existing for. It'll be a fun game to see if it's the blood loss or the infection that gets to them first. That was pretty insane. What about something to lighten the mood? Next up, we got a fun one with a fun name. That's right, the Head Crusher. Now, this thing is pretty complex, so I'd get it if you can't quite understand what it does. Okay, so essentially, you put this beautiful contraption on someone's head. The next step, and this is really important, you crush it. With the use of this twisty thing at the top of the machine. The real beauty of this contraption is that it's customizable. Want to crush their head completely? Righty-tighty. Want to only kind of crush their head? Lefty-loosey. But on a serious note, this thing was a monster. Bite down on your teeth right now. See how that feels. Imagine doing that, but not being able to stop. As the victim's head was crushed, their eyes would slowly bulge and then pop out of their heads. Their teeth would be crushed against each other, and their facial muscles would compress. And according to Wikipedia, while this was happening, the torturer would sometimes tap on their helmets with a hammer, just for the fun of it. And then they'd keep twisting and make your head explode. Fun and creative. Jeez, that sounds like fun. Next up, we got a torture method that was extremely popular in the Holy Roman Empire, with coin forgers, and like coin forgers specifically. The torture method was boiling alive. Victims would be plopped straight into a tub of oil or water, which would then be heated to insane temperatures. Torturer's choice, whether you want the victim to start out boiling or to slowly heat up while they're in the tank. Some people have survived being boiled alive for up to 2 whole hours, as the torturer slowly heats the pot. Like you're a lobster. A giant lobster. First, your extremities, like your fingers, will begin to burn, since those have the most nerve endings. You may be thinking, well, at least I'll lose consciousness fast since it's so painful. No. Studies show that you'd be alive the entire time. Your organs would then begin to cook inside your body. If you looked at yourself, you would notice that your entire body is red in a giant blister. But unfortunately, you wouldn't be able to do that, because by then your eyes would have been permanently destroyed. Congratulations, you are now blind. But luckily, there's good news. Even though you won't be able to see, you'll be able to smell yourself cooking alive. And let's face the facts, it'll probably smell like chicken. Eventually, the fat that's protecting your body would begin to break down and cook, and your skin would turn leathery and rough. But luckily by then, a lot of your nerves will have died. So instead of physical pain, it'll mainly be mental panic. And at that point, only after you've experienced your internal organs cooking and your eyes burning out of your head, will you be allowed to pass on. That was pretty funky. YouTube thinks that you'll like this video over here. And if you made it to the end, subscribe.